You can start.
A warm welcome to INHAF's 65th webinar. Today's webinar is organized by INHAF in collaboration with Sustainabledevelopmentgoals Foundation, the National Civic Arts Society, Asia Initiatives, and the International Society of Biourbanism. Before introducing and handing over to today's speakers, I will take a few minutes to explain the context within which the INHAF webinar series Rethinking Cities was conceptualized last year in June 2020. At the time, the series was in response to the pandemic and the online mode of operation, but it also was and is building on INHAF's earlier and ongoing work. In 2016, INHAF worked to bring together a civil society response around the Habitat 3 conference, leading to the submission of what became known as the Delhi Declaration document at Quetta. From this, it was suggested to then conceive of a civil society think tank on India's urban challenge. Following this, and on the back of efforts to set up a National Commission on Urbanization and a State Commission on Urbanization, INHAF decided to spearhead Citizens Urban Initiative, or CITUE. This initiative began with a few assumptions about the country's growth. For a start, cities as they are and the way they are developing do not appear to be able to meet the challenge of an unprecedented population growth. UN data indicates that India's urban population in particular will double to become 877 million by 2050. This growth of, in particular, second and third tier cities is intrinsically linked to economic transformation, but we know that growth is accompanied by negative externalities with huge environmental and social costs. Governmental effort towards this urban transformation that is taking place in our cities is not adequate on its own. And INHAF's view is that for any new approach to be transformative, it must be located within a collective multidisciplinary effort. The webinar series is able to feed into this thinking by engaging with people and resources that strengthen the initiative, build a supporting constituency, and create wider ownership. The initiative hopes to achieve three broad objectives: reassess India's urban challenge, rethink the Indian city, and reformulate the response in the context of national development challenges. Through this webinar series, we have had over 90 knowledge partners and over 300 urban experts, professionals, civil society organizations, and community groups all coming together to share their perspectives on multiple themes. From this is emerging a wider and deeper understanding of the challenges facing our cities and the role that we all have to play. It raises important questions relevant now more than ever in the context of climate change and pointing towards the need to outline a different roadmap for the near future. Today's discussion is on architecture in transition. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Michael Mehaffy, who is an educator, researcher, author, planner, designer, builder, and project manager. He has held appointments in architecture, planning, and philosophy at 7 graduate institutions in 6 countries. Dr. Mehaffy is also on the editorial boards of 3 international journals of urban design, and is co-author of over 30 scientific papers and over 20 books. In addition to managing Structura Naturalis Incorporated, he is executive director of the Sustainabledevelopmentgoals Foundation, and he also manages the International Making Cities Livable Conference Series. Without taking away more time, Dr. Mehaffy, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kia, and thank you everyone. Hello, and I'm delighted to be part of what I think is a very meaningful discussion on a very important topic. And I'm going to share my screen and provide, I hope, some grist for the mill, so to speak. And as you see, we're talking about, can you see this okay? This doesn't look like the right screen. Are you seeing the whole screen or just the smaller part of it?
Smaller part of it, sir.
Let me see if I can make it behave here.
You can just click on the use slideshow thing.
Which one?
Use slideshow.
Use slideshow. There we go. How does that look?
Yeah, it's
Great.
full screen.
So this session is titled Toward a New Urban Agenda. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the new urban agenda and how it informs, I think, where we are as a profession at this moment in our history. We in the architecture profession and the planning professions and the other related professions. I'm delighted to be joined by a number of eminent co-panelists, Geeta Mehta, who's an architect and urban designer, Don Ruggles, an architect and with Ruggles Mabe Studio, has done some fascinating work on neuroscience and beauty and what we're learning from that field these days. Ranjit Sabikhi is an eminent architect, principal of Ranjit Sabikhi Associates. Stefano Serafini is not an architect. We're delighted to have a non-architect in our midst who can give us a philosophical perspective as a psychologist. Justin Shubow, who's the president of the National Civic Arts Society in the United States as well. And then we're also going to have a discussant, our colleague Nikos Salingaros, who will give us some feedback after we do our presentation. And we hope we're going to have some time for a discussion after that as well. So I mentioned the new urban agenda. I think many in the audience are familiar with this outcome document. I was a participant in that process, working with our colleagues at UN Habitat. It was the outcome document at Habitat 3, which was the International UN Conference in 2016. And that document was adopted by consensus by all 193 countries of the United Nations. What that means is that this is now adopted urban policy for all of these countries. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's implemented. That's a critical challenge that remains, but it's certainly a milestone in saying this is a document that has now been adopted. And it has a lot of language in it to address the challenges that we're all aware of, that we all recognize: climate change, rapid urbanization, quality of life issues, sustainability issues that are very, very profound, as we all recognize. And so what it's proposing is essentially a much more interconnected idea of urbanism that's polycentric, that has urban spatial frameworks, that has compactness and density, mixed use, and all the things that we've all, I think many of us in our professions come to recognize are very, very important. And particularly the role of public space, which I'll talk about in a little more detail. So that was the document that was adopted in 2016. As I said, public space certainly looms large in it. Our colleagues at UN Habitat worked very much on that. There's something like 9 paragraphs that discuss the importance of public space, not just as an amenity, but as a network, as a connected framework, if you will, of public spaces that bring us into contact with one another, that allow opportunities, economic opportunities, opportunities for well-being and exercise and being together and getting all the benefits that we get from cities. And that language is also in the Sustainable Development Goals, the other document milestone that was adopted about the same time. And that mirror of that language is no accident. Our colleagues at UN Habitat worked very hard to get that, and we were very pleased to be working with them to do that as well. So some of the benefits of public space that the document describes, things like social interaction and inclusion, human health and well-being, economic exchange, cultural expression, resilience, and many, many other benefits. And those benefits are actually very well supported by the research that has emerged about public space and about cities as networks. And yet at this historical moment, public space is in alarming decline around the world, from privatization, from fortification, from erosion by private interest, and so on. And this is something that is having very negative impacts on the people in cities and on the sustainability of cities. Even at the economic level, this is research that shows that what Jane Jacobs referred to as the kind of interactions that occur on the lowly sidewalk are very, very important. And those that occur in public spaces, important for the economy of cities and what cities really give us as economic engines. And the work of Eric Kleinenberg talks about how very important public space is as a connective tissue for resilience during a crisis, to bring us into context when we have a urban crisis. In fact, the degradation and fortification of urban public space was one of the 4 key conditions that Kleinenberg identified as a cause of deaths in the Chicago heat wave in 1995, the seminal work that he did on that. So I think we recognize now that this is actually not just a matter of resilience, it's a matter of life and death, literally, for our cities to improve the quality of our public spaces. And there's a lot more research along those lines as well that I could, I won't take the time to go through in detail. Research not only on the social benefits and the resilience benefits, but the ecological benefits, heat island effects, shade and comfort, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of other benefits that are borne out by the research. But again, this is where we are at this current moment in our history. We are rapidly urbanizing. We are in many ways moving in the wrong direction. This is Beijing in 2000, and this is Beijing in 2009. The extent of the city has increased 4-fold, but the population has not increased 4-fold, which means that the density is going down, the sprawl is going up. We are urbanizing in ways that are not sustainable, that are in many cases sprawling and resource inefficient. And yet we have to recognize also, I think, that this is bringing some people out of poverty. There are some good effects, but there are some very alarming effects right around the world, in the Americas, in Asia, Africa, Europe, all over the world right now. And so we need to recognize the urgent need to overcome poverty and its ills, which can be done through rapid urbanization, but at the same time by, if you will, avoiding this kind of crack cocaine of economic development that produces a quick economic high produced by a kind of planetary hangover. We must find another model, a transition model, and I think that model is before us, and we need to find out, figure out how to make that transition. And this matters very much for greenhouse gas emissions, as my own research has shown. The difference between, for example, city emissions per capita and country emissions in a place like New York that's more compact and walkable, and the average US city, or the difference between Sweden and the United States, which is more compact and walkable, or Stockholm, indeed, between Stockholm and Sweden, again, a doubling of the greenhouse gas emissions for the average Swedish settlement. And look at this, a 6-fold increase between the average Stockholm resident and the average US resident of typical US cities. And the major factor there is not, of course, that they are 6 times happier or 6 times wealthier. They're not in the United States. They're simply 6 times less efficient and 6 times more wasteful, frankly, in the ways that we move about and consume resources. And so that's something that is a very disturbing issue when we're thinking about climate change, one that I think is underappreciated. Yes, density is certainly a factor. You can intuitively understand that bringing things into closer proximity will reduce the required resources to move around and infrastructure and so on. And in fact, you can see a very strong correlation in San Francisco, for example, where I used to live. In fact, the low emissions per capita is correlated closely with the high density per capita, or the high density of those neighborhoods. And conversely, the low density is correlated very closely with high emissions per capita. But it is not just density, but also other factors of urban morphology, mix of destinations and uses, connectivity, transportation choice, compact housing, and so on. And as I mentioned, I lived in this neighborhood, which is a wonderful, very livable neighborhood. It provides walkability and transportation choice and a mix of destinations, the grocery store right below our home there. And it's a very desirable, beautiful place as well. Conversely, the area with high emissions in the East Bay is much lower density, much more fragmented and car dependent. All of the factors that I was just describing that are very troublesome when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, and frankly, other factors of isolation and all the other things we were just talking about. And this is not only a matter of greenhouse gas emissions, but also economic issues. The Great Recession of 2008 began in exactly these drive till you qualify suburbs. This is in Houston, showing the mortgage foreclosures that began in exactly these areas. So this is an economic issue, an issue of economic unsustainability as much as an issue of the other factors that we've been describing. And so when you tally up, as I did in my own research, the factors of urban morphology and sprawl, they amount to something on the order of at least 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is an amazing number, and I think a very important number for us to get a handle on, not only because of the direct emissions from the tailpipe of automobiles, but all the other things that are part of that system, the choice architecture, if you will, of that kind of drive-through lifestyle, as opposed to a more walkable, mixed, diverse, bikeable, et cetera, transportation choice, and so on. So we must think differently about this model. And this is a model that we chose as a profession. We did this. We actually chose the model on the left. We said, no, the model on the right is too messy and chaotic and unsanitary. And we segregated everything. We made everything mechanized. We encapsulated the workplace and encapsulated the home and connected them with the capsule of the car. And there was no public space really in that scheme. Where you had public space, it was very low density and sort of perfunctory, did not bring us into contact with one another in any meaningful way. And this is the model that is still locked in to many of our systems around the world, the model of a global modern planning system and architecture system that goes back to the SIAM, the Athens Charter of 1933, as was described by Jean Clos, who was the General Secretary of Habitat 3, with his colleagues Saskia Sassen, Richard Sennett, and Ricky Burdett, describing, laying the problem at the feet of this modern movement of 1933, and saying that we really need to move beyond that. We need to understand a different model of the city as a contact system, as our friend Mike Batty puts it, and his colleague. We need to, as Richard Sennett says, apply ideas about open systems that are animating the sciences and learn from the sciences, learn why public space is so important, why, as Jane Jacobs put it, the kind of problem a city is, a problem of organized complexity. So I think we in the planning and design professions, architecture profession, must integrate more the lessons from network science, understanding economics and ecology and so on. Also understand the lessons from anthropology, sociology, how public space works, how people interact within public space, how game theory works, how generative processes work in mathematics and in other fields, how evolutionary morphology works, and cities as evolutionary systems that have a history, that build on that history and become richer over time instead of wiping away and starting from zero. Understanding cognitive, environmental, and social psychology, topics like biophilia, why certain environments are conducive to our health and well-being, and what those characteristics are that are naturally consistent with natural forms and so on. And I want to briefly mention some new research that my colleague Nikos Salingros and I have been working on symmetry, the mathematical concept, the broader concept, not just left and right, but all the other forms of symmetry, the fractal patterns, the translational and rotational patterns, and so on. We've done research that indicates there is evidence for something we call a symmetry deficit disorder in the built environment that has real consequences for human health and well-being and for sustainability. The environment on the right that is actually more stressful, more disruptive of public space, disruptive of human well-being and interaction than the environment on the left. And these are knowable mathematical properties that we can now begin to discuss rationally. I also want to mention this work, the new work on pattern languages. Some of you may be familiar with the book, the original book of pattern language. This is a new pattern language that addresses many of the new challenges of the new urban agenda, all the challenges that we've just been describing. And it has a companion wiki that you can explore just by typing in npl.wiki. What's not so well known among architects, they think, oh, well, this is that old book that by that guy, that's cute. And so on. No, actually a pattern language has become a very important methodology in software, design patterns or pattern languages of programming. It led directly to Wiki and to Agile. Agile Manifesto was co-developed by our colleague Ward Cunningham, who was inspired by pattern languages. Wikipedia was a direct outgrowth of pattern languages. We wrote a paper called Wiki as Pattern Language, Ward Cunningham and I. It's part of the Mac software programming. So many other fields have used pattern language methodology very effectively, but many architects are ignorant about this. They don't understand why this is happening. What is the underlying logic? And it goes right back to what I was describing before, the web relationship of design elements that Alexander was exploring when he developed pattern languages, the sort of nearly decomposable hierarchies of a design problem, as Herbert Simon referred to it. And Alexander referred to these nearly decomposable web-like relationships that he referred to as overlap or a semi-lattice or a web network that you can then begin to describe in clusters of design, reusable design elements that he later referred to as patterns. And that was the logical basis of pattern languages that became very, very important in many other domains. Not so important in architecture, again, partly because pattern languages were successful, the book was successful, but also partly because we in the architecture and related professions have not been as literate in these other fields as we should be. So there's my colleague Ward Cunningham and I at the World Urban Forum launching this new book, intending to sort of unlock the architectural version of pattern languages and begin to add many more patterns and edit the patterns, change the patterns, transform and create this wiki that allows them to be transformed. Here's a couple of the patterns very briefly: local symmetry, fractal pattern, human scale detail. Again, very sort of human focused, bottom up architectural approaches, construction, ornament, self-build, and so on. Many of the other challenges that we're all dealing with today. And again, there's a wiki component to this where patterns can be added, they can be edited, we can adapt them to new things, we can share them, we can do new things, pretty much anything that a app can do, a pattern can do in this new federated wiki system that Ward has developed. Very exciting. So I think we have a new agenda before us, not only a new urban agenda, but a new scientific agenda, a new agenda of how we can go about changing the way we do things and the way we can improve our cities, and understanding also that this is all about inclusiveness, because as my colleague Luis Betancourt has shown, when you bring people together into a network, you get, through Metcalfe's law, you get benefits to the whole system. But when you exclude populations for whatever reason, for marginalizing populations or cutting them off or fragmenting the city, you're going to make that city perform worse over time compared to other cities. So this is good for everyone's bottom line to have an inclusive city. And there are people who recognize this. You've heard of the work probably of Edward Glaser and Richard Florida. This is the basis of what's called agglomeration benefits in cities that give us the great economic benefits, but they were focused too much, I think, on the core, on the idea that, you know, you only bring the elites into the core of the cities and then you get all of these sort of trickle down effects for everybody else. But that's, I think, misunderstanding the nature of how networks work. You need to spread it around a little more. Yes, there are things called rich club networks that are very powerful, but there are also inclusive networks that bring more people into the network. And I think Florida and Glaser both recognize the weaknesses of their approach and have begun to reflect on the need to include everyone in a larger network. Again, going back to Metcalfe's law and the need to spread it around and to have diversity in the city, including geographic diversity. I think part of our problem with the populist backlash against the elites and against the cores of cities is very much related to this problem that we've over-concentrated. We've used a kind of voodoo urbanism. You know, George Bush Sr. talked about voodoo economics, the trickle-down approach, and we've done that with cities. We've over-concentrated and over-relied on our elite cores to do too much of the work, and that is not economically sustainable. Lastly, I want to touch on this course that we now have online. And I won't try to describe this link. Maybe you can take a screenshot of it if you would like to, or perhaps, I don't know if we can get that into the chat. This is a course that you can take on your own, a self-guided course that covers a number of these topics that we've been describing. Nikos Salingaros has been involved in developing this. This is a part of a number of curriculum reforms that we've been developing and proposing to help to make this great transition. And I think we all recognize we're going to have to do. So on that note, I'm going to thank everyone for allowing me to participate and turn it over to the next speaker, who will be Geeta Mehta.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's an amazing introduction to what we really should be talking about in academia, in business, in planning, professions, everywhere. So thank you, Michael. That was very, very powerful. So I'm going to actually share my screen now and talk a little bit more about some of the things that you have mentioned, which are also important, but I'm going to start by saying, really alluding to what you were saying, that architecture and urban design are social acts, so they must have a social purpose, right? And in so many schools of architecture and urban planning, it's about making maps, it's about form making. Architecture is certainly not about form making. We have a huge responsibility and we need to react to that and design with that. So what is the social purpose needed in India right now? It's inclusivity, it's inclusive access to healthy environments, infrastructure, public spaces, education, upskilling, healthcare, economic opportunities, and public safety. So we are talking about a paradigm where we are talking about cities of justice, cities of equality for everyone, not just for the elite. And I think what has brought us all to this one point in history is that there has been, especially since 1980s in India and the world, too much emphasis just on financial capital. And we have to recognize that financial capital is just one kind of capital. And the purpose of financial capital is to improve ecological and social capital. But we have kind of only focused on financial capital, which is, the hyper neoliberalism that has, the effects of that are here to see. We are on the edge of ecological disaster, actually. So what would we do that would be different? For example, we need to design welcome centers for migrants. We need to, because migrants are, as Michael mentioned, that our urban population is going to keep on growing, particularly in India. It's really a very big opportunity actually to bring people in and make them able to contribute to the economy, to the environment. And so it should not be seen as a problem, but seen as an opportunity. But in order for that to be an opportunity, we have to change how we design cities. We have to make cities very welcoming and comfortable for these people. These are our heroes. So these welcome centers would provide information on housing, jobs, education, healthcare, legal help, free internet, opportunities for their children. And COVID has really brought these issues to the forefront. These are pictures of migrants walking back to their villages because there were no jobs and there was no housing for them or any amenities for them. So this totally has to change. It's really urgent right now. So a lot of people, like in Mumbai, 60% of the population lives in 0.6% of land, which is informal settlements. But we are not designing for informality. Most of the master plans where there are informal settlements, they just put a gray color and as if we don't know anything about that. But that's where design should be. And the other big issue, as Michael mentioned, is corporate capture of cities. Who's designing cities? Not urban planners. corporations and developers and real estate is designing cities, and we need to change that. It used to be in India that a developer made 400% profit by urbanizing agriculture land and then building gated communities on it. So somewhat it's now under control, but it's really a huge problem because there are very big externalities to these towers in the park in terms of ecology, in terms of social impact. So low-income housing, there are a lot of slum redevelopment authority in India is moving people from informal settlements to these amazingly bad situations, which are going to make poverty permanent for them and intergenerational. And this is an absolute crime. We really need to think about housing, not just as four walls and tenure, some sort of tenure, but these are very unhealthy situations where there's no sunlight and ventilation, so people have to keep their fans on all the time. So this is this sort of thing, you know, we really need to learn from and move away from. So how do we move away from it? For example, this is a picture of Calcutta Wetlands, in Calcutta Wetlands, you see that you know, people who are really making this wetland work are actually living in really poor circumstances, whereas the wetland is providing such a huge benefit to the city of Calcutta and processing most of its sewage. So perhaps, you know, there needs to be a system of social credits and green credits that people can exchange for housing and healthcare and education. So access to healthy environment is critical. Clean air, water. In India, the cities are becoming more and more polluted. New Delhi, the capital, is a very good example of what is happening. But there are solutions. This is Mohalla clinics made by Aam Aadmi Party that are working really well. So we need decentralized sewage, waste systems. Governance is an issue, so we need to decentralize creation of these mega infrastructures, decentralize that, and decentralize control. So what happens when you just try to centralize everything and say, okay, now the government is going to take care of it, and the community custodianship breaks down? This is Varanasi, and the picture on the left is the number of ponds it had, and the picture on the right is how many are left now. So this is alarming, and this is happening in nearly every city in India. And then we say that there are floods. Of course, there are floods. If you remove all the water holding bodies that really sustained the rain and helped it to percolate in the soil, if you take all that away, of course, there are going to be floods. And the irresponsibility of the Sabarmati Riverfront project is being replicated in cities, which is really alarming. This is the Prime Minister Modi's project that he's very proud of, so many cities want to do it. But what they did is took an organic river that really needed you know, ecological support and instead put it into concrete channels. And then made it into, you know, some kind of a project to be proud of. And the similar kind of thing is being proposed in Pune. And the picture on the right is my students' work, you know, showing that no, Mulamutha River does not need to be concretized, but it needs to be revitalized in terms of green infrastructure and connecting it to its floodplains and nalas. And water holding systems. That's what needs to be thought about for rivers and not concretizing them. Of course, we need inclusive transportation. Smart cities are not where poor drive, but where the rich take public transport. But unfortunately, you know, I think Delhi is the only city in the world where they did install BRT and had to rip it apart because there was so much pressure from people driving cars who couldn't stand that one lane of their road was taken away by public transport. So yeah, access to safe streets and public spaces. Michael has talked much about that. And Michael, you also mentioned about Jane Jacobs. She said the city planners are ravaging our cities. And yes, it's happening very much. I don't know if anyone had a chance to see Citizen Jane, but I got a chance to make my spiel in that film that was made in 2017. But yes, right now, Indian planners are ravaging our cities. So we need to think about alternatives. And so I had the opportunity to found or co-found two nonprofit organizations to really resist this sort of work or this sort of problems that are happening. One is Herbs that I co-founded with Matthias Echanove and Rahul Srivastava. And so this is user-generated cities, learning from user-generated cities. Our office is in Dharavi, and we have been there for 9 years now. This was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York about tactical urbanism and experiential urbanism and street-based urbanism. And why that is superior than what is being built right now in so many of our cities. So Dharavi, for example, I know Nikos has also done much work in that, but it's rich in social capital. Dharavi contributes over $1 billion a year to Mumbai's economy. And why is it a slum? Because calling something a slum enables the government or gives the government a right to redevelop it. And that is why things get, areas get called slums. And also they get called slums because the government withholds infrastructure from them. But if you gave people tenure, it doesn't have to be, there can be shades of tenure. They will improve their homes and give them infrastructure. And this will very quickly turn into a middle income sort of lower middle income community or a healthy community, because people here are lawyers, policemen, doctors, nurses. And why should those people not have a place to live in the city? Why should they have to go on the edges of the city as far away from their work, as the government would like to put them? So I think these are really the serious critical issues, the right to the city. And at Herbs, we developed a tool house typology, which means that the house does not have to be 4 walls and a roof. It needs to have opportunities for people to increase their income, increase their well-being. Children can play on the street and mothers can watch them. And people can have maker spaces where potters and carpenters and other trades can work, place for people to set up their push cart that they're going to sell vegetables on all day. So that's what we should think about, low-income housing or low income for people who will, we should hope that they will soon have better income. So that's how we should design. We should not design to perpetuate poverty, which is what is happening now. The other nonprofit I founded is called Asia Initiatives, and it's particularly focused on women's place in the city and in economy. And so we actually created a community currency for social good. We call social capital credit. So people earn it. I don't know if you can see my cursor. People earn it by doing social good, helping their community or the environment. They earn socks. And then they can spend them on their own education, healthcare, and upskilling. We have an app where these things are transacted. We are working in several countries and have won several awards, including one that said, it's a world-changing idea. So all our projects start with Socratic dialogues. And this is a dialogue happening for Mumbai-Pune Expressway, which has a maximum number of deaths in the country. And this is with truck drivers and asking them, well, why is it these accidents happen and how do you think they can stop? So the result of such dialogues are earning and redeeming menus so that people can earn by doing social good and redeem for education, healthcare, and upskilling. And we won the competition in Amravati, which was, I don't totally agree with many ideas of Amravati city, taking very fertile farmland and making a low density city. In Singapore, they are not going to allow any building under 50 stories anymore. You know, density is good. We need to really understand. And Michael, you said that very well. But we won this, there was a competition, and this was really to increase the public participation. This is a dialogue going on with some of our staff, and women are designing their own public spaces. The picture I showed you earlier of the social, of the low-cost housing, the terrible thing that's being built, it's on the left actually. So these 10-story buildings are just 4 meters apart, and people throw trash in it because there's no better way to deal with that. So we, through SOX, we are, and working with the Curry Stone Foundation, a local nonprofit, we are improving these public spaces, bringing people in, making them custodian of space. People have to be part of the solution. It's not that planners can design something and implement, because implementation is where most things in India fall apart. This is Vaigai River in Madurai. And what we try to do is divide the waterfront, riverfront into small lengths, and communities behind that became custodians of this. To make sure that there was no sewage being dumped, no construction debris was being dumped, and actually to plant trees and improve the areas. So I will close by just going back to the new urban agenda and 17 sustainable development goals. But if you look at them carefully, each one of them is affected by how we design our cities, every single one of them, even though only goal 11 is about sustainable cities, but actually every one of them is affected. And another thing of interest is that 8 of those goals are about social capital, and 5 are about ecological capital, and only 4 are about financial capital. And yet, you know, the emphasis is always on, oh, we want to grow financially. No, it has to really change to become more holistic. So I will close with that, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geeta, and wonderful work. And certainly, you know, what you're talking about in terms of the economic development that Jane Jacobs talked about a lot, that's a human-centered development of human beings, not just development of capital as an abstraction, is certainly at the center of a lot of what we struggle with. So I'm pleased to now turn it over to our friend Don Ruggles, who will be presenting some fascinating work on neuroscience and the phenomenon of beauty. Don?
Thank you, Michael. So honored to be with this esteemed group of professionals today and to be supported by such a remarkable organization as INHAF. Such an honor to be with you. So let's see, I will start the screen sharing process here. How is that? Is that good?
That looked great.
Okay, thank you. It's always a miracle when I can get these things to work. So usually I have tech support, but it's a little bit early here in the morning. So I'm not at my office, so I don't have that crutch to fall back on. So in about 2 weeks, INHAF is going to screen a film that I was part of making. It's titled Built Beautiful. And that film is focused on the coming together of neuroscience and architecture, those 2 disciplines. And it's a film that includes 20 professionals from around the world discussing the importance of beauty and the emerging discipline of neuroaesthetics. In the film, Dean Hans Butzer states we are beings that are always looking for safe space. And therein lies one of the most succinct and seminal concepts of the movement, that survival is one of the primary motivators for our decisions and actions every minute of every day. And it's a powerful force in our lives. That's survival. Well, what if I told you that there's another equally powerful and motivating force in our lives, and one that's been overlooked by architects and designers and planners now for almost 100 years, and that force is pleasure. And it's pleasure that will lead us to beauty. It's beautiful is an intuitive emotional response that implies inspiration, wonderment, awe, and curiosity at its most fundamental sense of pleasure. Yet the phrase has all but disappeared from the world of art and architecture. It's been marginalized to where it's seen as a romantic notion from a bygone era. That is until recently, when neuroscience started to unlock some of the mysteries of the brain and show us just how important beauty is to our health and well-being. This all began for me back in the 1970s when I started to notice that our clients were using two distinctive words to describe our projects. Some projects were described as exciting and interesting, and others were described as beautiful. And I wondered why our work would generate such diametrically opposed descriptions and emotions. So we started to research this, and that research ultimately led me to neuroscience. And beauty is a fascinating concept, of course. Philosophers have dealt with this idea for thousands of years, and in recent years, scientists have come to know that there are two kinds of beauty. There's the type of beauty that you acquire as you live your life and tune your brain to the environment around you. And then there's the type of beauty that you are programmed with from birth to look for and to acknowledge. And here are some of those innate beautiful scenes that we're all born looking for and intuitively knowing. A beautiful, quiet scene from nature. A beautiful, awe-inspiring sight in the landscape. The beautiful wonderment of the stars. The beauty of a broad view with a sunset or sunrise and a body of water. These are all scenes that are uniformly known as beautiful around the world. And most importantly, the beauty of faces of all types. So these are just a few of the scenes and pattern types that we're born looking for. And these patterns have a direct relationship with architecture and design via our neurological processing. So how does this apply to the projects that I was observing with the diametrically opposed descriptions and emotions? Well, it all comes back to how our brain processes neurological inputs, and our brains are taxed with processing over 11 million bits of information per second. And the only way for that to be processed is for the brain to segment the data into pattern types. That allows the brain to work efficiently and quickly. And it turns out that exciting and beautiful are connected to two deeper and more fundamental neurological responses, and those are survival and pleasure. At the most fundamental level, humankind's genetically predisposed to seek two things, survival and pleasure. Every day, our bodies process billions of actions without us even being aware of it, and all of them are geared towards these two goals. An amazing 95% of all actions processed by our brains are intuitive and subconscious. and all are geared to survival and pleasure. Well, here are two examples of how we process pattern types and put them into these categories. Here's an architectural image that contains both pattern types, an exciting survival geometric pattern and a beautiful pleasure geometric pattern. We'll notice how the survival pattern of the new construction overwhelms the pleasure pattern of the original building as your subconscious is struggling to reconcile and make sense of these two forms. Here's another image that contains both survival and pleasure patterns as well. Normally, a table full of food, wine, and cheese in a meadow adjacent to a body of water would be a strong pleasure pattern. Yet the lightning has turned this into a survival pattern that dominates over the pleasure pattern. The purpose of showing you these two slides is to show you how the survival pattern overwhelms the pleasure pattern. Neuroscientists theorize that the processing of survival patterns is actually 5 to 7 times stronger than pleasure patterns. And that is because we evolved to protect ourselves first and then look for pleasure afterwards. Well, this brings us to the next step of aligning our neurological processing with exciting and beautiful. We've been discussing subconscious neurological processing, and the brain has to have inputs to process, and those are provided, of course, by our nervous system. And because the discussion's dealing with subconscious processing, it's the autonomic nervous system that we're dealing with. And the autonomic nervous system is made up of two very important and inseparable streams of information, and those being sympathetic and parasympathetic inputs. And these streams of information directly affect our health and sense of well-being, both positively and negatively. Sympathetic inputs are considered survival inputs, and they align with exciting. Conversely, parasympathetic inputs are considered pleasure inputs, and they align with beautiful, as shown here in this graphic. So if a project is described as exciting, then that is a sympathetic response. And if it's described as beautiful, then that is a parasympathetic response. Well, following from that, there are some very important health attributes to be aware of here. Regarding sympathetic inputs, which of course, again, align with exciting and survival, it's known as fight or flight or flight or freeze response. The major characteristics of a sympathetic event are stress and anxiety. This type of event initiates elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and narrows your mental focus, also compromises your immune system performance. So sympathetic inputs not only make us feel ill, they're a downward pull on our general health and sense of well-being. And so regarding parasympathetic inputs, which again aligns with beauty and pleasure, this is known as rest and relaxation. The major characteristics of a parasympathetic event are calming, stress relieving, and feeling a sense of well-being. This type of event initiates a lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, optimizes critical functions in immunity and cell repair, and expands your mental focus, which this creates a general sense of well-being. So parasympathetic inputs not only make us feel good, they boost the general state of our health. So the core message here is that our subconscious brain is making decisions for us all day, every day, based on survival or pleasure patterns. And there are significant health ramifications to the patterns we encounter, both positive and negative. So architects, designers, and planners, because our designs are made up of patterns, can play an important role in society. It's imperative that we design for parasympathetic and beautiful inputs to support the balanced health of our nervous system. So important that these professions are now poised to assume a position of responsibility unlike any they have ever had before. all due to our new understanding of the brain and how it subliminally supports our lives, especially in regards to pleasure and beauty. Now, I know that many in the audience today are committed to creating beauty. And this is really important work you're doing, more important than you might realize, I suspect. You are literally supporting and improving the overall health of society and your clients as well. Today, stress is at an all-time high in society. Some medical professionals estimate that up to 80% of visits to a physician have a stress component. We are, it appears, coping with stress 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As just outlined, an effective antidote to this stress is to create parasympathetic environments that have a broad emphasis on stress relieving forms. And this broad emphasis will propel architects and designers and planners to a new and profoundly important role in the health and well-being movement. And all of this is supported by our new understanding that beauty is essential to our lives. So in closing, I'd like to say that I'm working with the Human Architecture and Planning Institute, and we're looking closely into patterns that affect us subliminally, that create pleasure responses, and working to connect patterns more directly with architecture, and also working on initiatives to develop educational focuses around the world. And that's one of the reasons for the movie, is to promote educational efforts. And that movie was recently picked up by a major distributor, so we'll be able to live stream it around the world. And also my website, neuroarchitectology.com, has many research papers, including some by Michael and Nikos, that if you're interested in this subject and wanting to know more about how to connect architecture with health and well-being via pleasure and beauty, please visit that website. If I can ever answer any questions for any of you, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Don. And I think what you're raising is so critical to everything we're talking about, because if we're serious about meeting these challenges of the future as professionals and as citizens, then we're going to have to take very seriously all the things that you have talked about, that Geeta talked about, the social factors, the economic factors, and the human psychology factors, and the need for beauty, the need for wellness in our environments. We can't simply do all this top down and only focus on the external forces that we as experts seem to think are so important. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Ranjit Sabikhi, who is an eminent practitioner, and many of you know his work, I'm sure, and he's going to share some thoughts with us also about where we are at this historical moment. I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm basically going to be talking without showing you any pictures, without showing you any diagrams, because I'm going to be talking about certain very, very important things that have been happening in recent times. I'm talking about the significance of major traumatic events that have occurred in India. Geeta gave you a good idea of what is the background or how things are happening in India. Showed you pictures and things which I think you will all relate to when I tell you about what is actually happening around here. I want to mention to you that I have been closely following the development that have been happening in the city of Delhi, where I have lived for the past 60 years. And I have seen how it has changed. In fact, in 1957, the first Delhi master plan was made. And this master plan was based on much of what was happening in post-war Europe. In fact, it was based on the advice of planners that were brought from the Ford Foundation, brought them, and they advised on how they should go about it. And it was essentially a kind of system where you had basically everything. The plan was based on single-use definition of all parts of the city and the layout of certain areas and so on. But what happened was that even though in Delhi they outlined the entire area, they laid out the roads, they defined the uses, they defined the areas which were to be the main district centers, which were to be centers of major zones of development, and a whole series of things was very, very clearly projected that this is what the city was going to be. And they started building it on that basis. But it's amazing that within a very short time, we found that things were beginning to change. They were not quite strictly following the master plan. And this was not, the planners still, of course, insisted that what they were doing was right. So were the administrators, so were the politicians. But yet, despite that, slowly things began to change. And it began really with the infiltration of offices, banks, medical clinics, etc., into residential areas. Now, one began to wonder, why did this happen? This really was happening in response to a need. There was a need which was not being catered for. This process of gradual change of use in response to actual need began to spread across the entire Delhi urban area as the city continued to expand in size with steadily increasing migration from the rural areas. Several changes were introduced in master plans, subsequent master plans, but the planners, the administrators, and the politicians never quite fully understood the organic process of change. They concentrated on extracting maximum revenue from the monetization of land. As a result of this, the needs of the urban poor, that consisted of almost 60% of the population of 230 million people, was never recognized or catered for. As per the master plan, housing for the urban poor was to be in the form of 1 or 2 room units with an average plinth area of 250 square meters to a maximum of 400 square meters. The development of such units built at ground level with adjoining space for future expansion was discouraged. And as this would involve more land, and instead such units were incorporated in multi-story structures. This meant the concentration of large numbers of people on small areas of land with little or no support facilities like schools, health centers, meeting spaces, shopping centers, banks, police stations, etc. These are all issues which I talk about, but which you have already seen pictures of what Geeta showed you of different parts of the city. And this has been the pattern of development that has been followed for over the last 30 years. In such a situation, a large part of the urban population had no real link with the city and maintained a strong connection with the villages and rural areas from where they had come. In early 2020, the first cases of the COVID-19 infection were confirmed, and within a short time, spread to several states across the country. On the night of 24th March 2020, the Prime Minister announced a nationwide lockdown with less than 4 hours notice. Within days, it became clear that India had plunged into an enormous human crisis. It is estimated that the lockdown resulted in 114 million job losses. 90 million were daily wage earners, and 20 million salary earners were also laid off. The livelihoods of the poor and marginalized were destroyed, and they were pushed to the brink of starvation. Over 25 million migrant workers headed for their homes in the rural areas. Geeta showed you pictures of this migration, the large numbers of people moving. But if you actually see the videos, it is horrifying, the conditions in which they had to move. Little or no help came from the government. Some workers and their families managed to get onto trains or onto trucks and buses at a cost which they could barely afford. But the larger number walked from a few hundred kilometers to over 1,200 kilometers along the road. They had no food or water, except for what was given to them by welfare activists and concerned citizens who set up free food distribution centers in towns and villages along the way. No real help was provided by the concerned authorities. On the contrary, in many places, they were subjected to undue harassment by the police and state authorities. After considerable publicity, a few free trains were run, but this also was soon discontinued, as they were not organized to cope with the massive demand. Large numbers of people lost their lives, but there is no proper record of the widespread impact on the lives of millions of migrants that emanated from this disaster. Despite the fact that conditions in the villages were worse, with no proper jobs and minimum earning capacity, most of these people had no intention of returning to the cities. As the COVID pandemic spread across the country from state to state, large numbers of people succumbed due to a variety of reasons, including inadequate health care, lack of oxygen cylinders, shortage of hospital beds, and so on. In the Delhi urban area, 25,600 residents lost their lives. In the rural areas in all the states, conditions were much worse. And to date, there is no proper accounting of the total number of deaths. Horrifying pictures of large numbers of funeral pyres stretching far beyond the confines of cremation grounds, including half-burnt bodies floating in the rivers along rural areas, were seen on the media. The government, of course, tried to sort of ignore all this. They tried to say this was fake media, but the fact is this happened. The central and state governments were unable to control the situation and resorted to a denial of the reality to avoid increasing panic. The lockdown has now been lifted, but there are still several cases of COVID in some states. The total number of COVID deaths across the country to date is 475,000 people. This is what is recorded. The actual number, we all know, is much, much higher than that. Before life had returned to normal in June 2020, the government promulgated 3 new farm laws relating to the sale price of 17 farm crops. Farmers in villages in Punjab soon realized that these laws would have a significant impact on their livelihood of small farmers, and the decision to protest soon spread to neighboring states and the national capital. On 27th November 2020, farmers from around 6,000 Punjab villages led a protest march to Delhi. They were stopped at the borders, so along with their tractors, the farmers and their families camped along the roads and set up temporary homes. Over 2,500 temporary settlements were set up around the national capital, and several protest marches were led from there into different parts of the city. More than 400,000 tractors turned up at a protest on Republic Day, 26 January 2021. Temporary settlements that stretched between 15 to 20 kilometers along the roads continued to function continuously. And you know, all these camps there was no proper arrangement for water, for food and everything, but people got together from surrounding areas, from other areas to help them. The people themselves made their own arrangements for food, and even there was things like certain farmers got together and brought a whole lot of washing machines so that people could wash their clothes and at least clean the clothes. But can you imagine this large numbers of people were camped on the outside of the city for 360 days. And this was until the Prime Minister announced the repeal of the farm laws just a few days ago on 19th November 2021. The protest had lasted for 360 days and 670 farmers lost their lives. Although the above may not be directly related to urban development, the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, the march of migrants to their homes, and the farmers' protests will over time be viewed as major historic events. And this will have a significant impact on the pattern of future settlements across the country. There are several important lessons that need to be learned from these events. First and foremost is the need to provide adequate space to all residents, both in their homes and public areas. This will call for a different approach to planning that avoids steadily increasing the concentration of residents in urban areas. This has been touched upon by other speakers also, but in our context, it really is quite different, because this is only possible with the development of new townships at a distance around major cities with adequate employment opportunities so that migrants may be diverted to new settlements. In a country as large as ours, with its enormous population, it is possible to use this strategy to gradually develop our rural areas. Settlements with industries related to agriculture, other development facilities, along with schools, health centers, universities, cultural facilities, and centers for the development of local crafts, tourist facilities related to the wide number of monuments that exist across our countries, tourism facilities related to natural features and beautiful parts of the country that we have, could bring about an enormous change over time. Such concepts, however, require a total shift from the current pattern of development, which seeks only to monetize land to extract maximum revenue, or blindly follow the pattern of enormous high-rise construction, emulating the examples of Shanghai and other Chinese cities. There is much inspiration that can be gained from a careful evaluation of our own historic settlements. I leave you with this to think about. This is something as to realize how actual happenings have affected the lives of the entire population. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranjit. And this is very moving and very disturbing on many levels. That reminds us of the better job we have to do, not only in design, but in policy and in really all the aspects of this new urban agenda, this new human agenda, really, for making a transition to another way of doing things, or ways of doing things. Now I'd like to turn it over to Stefano Serafini, who, as I just noted, is a psychologist, a philosopher, and we hope will give a broader perspective of where some of the scientific findings are leading us in these days, and the idea of integrating biology into our thinking about design and urbanism and biourbanism. Stefano.
Thank you, Michael. I'm still shocked by the previous talks. I mean, all the interventions will be very interesting, especially Professor Sabikhi and Professor Mehta touch my chords, and so I'm very very keen now to start this discussion with you. My presentation is mostly about putting questions to you, such esteemed colleagues, people who really work for making a better architecture, and so they try to give an impulse to life of all of us. So we start with discussion I got yesterday, actually, and let me see if I can start this. The discussion I have yesterday with some colleagues, they asked me to participate in a contest for, it's about the Visionaire in Or in Sweden. This what the main image you see is the city of Kiruna in northern Sweden. And substantially people are asking the government of Sweden and the European Union are asking to help making these places better for people and more attractive, more social, functional, so that can integrate people from different cultures, for example, and more ecological. And mind that these cities are not really cities, they are just posts in the North Circle, the polar circle. So our places are totally inhabitable. They're always under zero, they are always without sun, etc., etc. And one of the goals of this contest is about attracting immigrants to work in this area, especially Syrians. You know that Syria, one of the most beautiful countries in the world, the cradle of Mediterranean civilization, has been totally destroyed by the last war. And 5,000 people, especially young people, every day leave the country. So I talk to my colleagues and say, okay, you want to do something that is very effective because they are very good at doing that. But even if you do the best of your job, you are making something very evil. You are helping extracting human forces, human labor from other parts of the world. You become part of a machine that destroys this world. So apparently you make something that is green, that is beautiful, that is social, inclusive, etc. But in reality, you are going in the opposite direction. And this is an extreme example. That's why I refuse, of course, this collaboration. But you have to see that in a sense, our cities have become everywhere kind of North Pole. You know, places that are barely habitable for having a human life with dignity, etc. And here I put some points that we should stress. First of all, housing is not a human activity anymore, it's considered a commodity. Neighboring is a matter of spatial rather than social relations, as Michael was stressing very well. Dwelling is a material, not a spiritual action. And urban rules are disconnected from ethics. So we make urban rules based on other form of interest. As Professor Mehta say very well, it's not urban designer and it's not you, it's not me who designs cities, but is capital, is a big corporations. And so architecture becomes in a way kind of business decoration. We had for so long the idea of putting trees on top of skyscrapers to show how we are ecological or environmentally friendly. And it's like architecture is putting art on top of the business. And we are now preparing a kind of greenwashing of the top of this thermo-industrial Armageddon that we have in front of us, destroying the planet. So this kind of solution are very fashionable, presented as green. They are not. They are just another patch to the industrial system that keeps going on and destroy our society. In a way, extremizing, we have a beautiful, a chair for killing people that is alimented by solar power. So this is a kind of green social washing Auschwitz. That's what they say. I'm a little bit crude. I'm sorry for that, but I think we should stress this aspect. We are seeing now, we are noticing a technization of problems. So we transform everything in a language that allows us to address these issues without addressing the real issues that's behind them. This absent agenda, a big corporation and government after that are working on. So there is this phrase by Sergio Los. Professor Sergio Los is the father of Italian bioclimatic architecture. And he says, we don't even remember where landscape comes from, because landscape is something that we need. Beautiful landscape is the product of human activity. That's why in Italy you used to have such a beautiful landscape, and now these are so spoiled. Because now people don't design anymore landscape. For people, I mean peasants, farmers, I mean citizens, people who used to design the landscape we live in. Now they have no voice, and the landscape is rather designed by a kind of continuous concurrence, a continual fight among people and interests. So I would say, I will address this call to all our friends. This is Arjuna. Arjuna knows that when he goes on the battlefield, even if he doesn't want to kill his relative and his cousins and his friends, he needs to do it because he's a warrior. He has to follow his way. In a way, it's the European way of saying, become who you are, no? From the ancient Greece. Arjuna is a great teaching also for us as architects, as designers. And here I have one Arjuna quote. This phrase belongs to Robert Newert. Robert Newert studied slums all over the world. And with the Journal of Biourbanism, we published a critique of Quito, of all the urban agenda of Habitat 3. And he says, we need to stop forced evictions. So it's not a matter of making evictions something that can be mild on, etc. No, we have to stop them because we are at the service of people. We are not to rule the people. All cities plans need to be serving the needs of people. Every residence need to have access to fresh water, sanitation, electricity. Urbanagenda transformed the concept, saying that if you have bottled water, you have fresh water. And so we can say that we reduce the need of fresh water in the world. This is totally untrue. There is also a fake way of using numbers. Governments should recognize the importance of system D, that is the informal economy, the economy of life, and that is also the settlement of life. Professor Sabikhi was explaining a beautiful example of that. These farmers going to protest have been helped by the people, as really moving, but it's part of our reality that we are trying to take away by concrete, like we do with rivers. And governments on all levels must ratify radical transparency and local empowerment and the importance of doing things together. Now, there is a news a few days ago. The government of India says that they halved informal economy in the country. Like this was a beautiful thing. It's exactly as doing, we made a beautiful thing because we put concrete around the banks of a river. In fact, half of the people were working in the system D, that is the débrouillard, the system of self-economy, let's say, didn't see any change. So it's just, again, a game of numbers. But what's worse is that probably this system D, this economy, is really important for our life. It's something like a churning that produce life and a rich economy. If you put all the informal economy of the world together, you would have the first economy in the world after the United States. It's a huge power in the world. Robert Newert, I don't know if you can see this poem, made a beautiful kind of poem manifesto about New York City, And he says that this city is not anymore a city, it has become a huge skyscraper, something that is elevated, get disconnected from life, from the little imperfection, from creativity, etc. Our cities tend to become a kind of huge machine that produce only elevation of the rich against the poor and kills life. We are told for many years that smart cities are the solution. So we make cities that are smart. I say smart cities are for dumb citizens. They are not the solution, they are the disease. Shoshana Zuboff made this beautiful book about the capitalism of control. We have the form of new extraction of economic power from data. And that's also what about smart cities are. What is my proposal? Most of you know this handsome guy. Bezim Hakim is a scholar who's devoted his life to understand why ancient cities were much more beautiful than what we do now. And he found out this concept of codes. You mostly are familiar with that. Codes, urban codes, are kind of non-written laws that were applied, in fact, by people, normal people, not architects, not only architects, in building cities, creating this magnificent piece of work that we can still admire all over the world, not only in the Mediterranean area. He made this beautiful book, Mediterranean Urbanism, when he synthesized 50 years of work on this subject. And he explained very well how these rules are the same that we can see now when people build slums. Robert Newert explained his experience of slums. He went living in slums all over the world, and he found that there were free cities where people can call themselves free because they have a space for acting and also creating their own space. That is fundamental for human being. This is the city where I live, Artena. Artena is a little town belonging, has been founded in the 13th century, is near Rome, Italy, and is not accessible by car. There is no way. The car can only stop here in the main piazzas, and then you have to walk, and we use mules still now for bringing heavy stuff into the houses. To the right, you see the image of a wheelchair. I put this image here because people say, oh, this city is not accessible. Well, one great architect, a young architect, friend of mine from Holland, is on wheelchair since he was 14 years old. He has been visiting 5 times Artena, participating in our urban schools, and he never felt in difficulties there. The city was accessible because there was social accessibility. People were helping him. And this makes a huge difference. So infrastructure is not only physical infrastructure. First of all, is an ethical infrastructure. I'm discussing with families living here because the city gets to be abandoned because this ideology of cars seeps in also in this little town that is still resisting, but it still have a community. Young people told me, oh, I cannot live here anymore because I will have a child soon and I cannot use a stroller. Well, I mean, stroller, there is actually an expansion of the model we built cities for with flat streets made for cars. This doesn't mean accessibility, this means car dependence. So I call for a city landscape of flesh and spirit, because we need more meaningful connection. The connection Michael was showing before, that are also corresponding to some neurophysiological connection, are mostly made of stone, but this stone represents flesh and spirit, the relations that we have as human beings. As a biourbanist says that we should connect our design to life world. And this is my proposal of a design. Of course, I understand when I talk as a non-architect, when I talk to professionals, they tell me, Stefano, you're right, but we have also to survive, we need to work. And most of the time we have to deal with the market. The market is what decides everything. So it's very difficult to say, okay, be Arjuna, go fight. But we can start trying to build a different way, a different approach that is very aware of the connection, the need of connection between what we do and the effects, the moral effects that we have on population. Here I left a little bibliography for people who are interested. You can take a picture. I don't know if this video will go around. And I leave it like that. You told me, Michael, to be short, and I've been short. So
well, people can take a screenshot of that if they would like to. Stefano, can you go back? Yeah, just hold that for a second. If anyone likes to take a screenshot of that, that's great. Thank you.
I will stress that one book that has been published this year, Building for Hope, towards an architecture belonging by Marwa Al-Saboni. She's a Syrian architect. She's been here in Artena too, for our summer school. And she first became super famous because of her first book, The Battle for Home. The Battle for Home is possibly the most strong attack on modern urbanism that has been written in the last 100 years. It's impressive. It shows very well how the Syrian tragedy mostly belong to the way the cities have been destroyed. And so social relation between people. The book is really impressive. The second book is more constructive. So here Marwa started to put on the balance her wisdom about how to build the connection that has been destroyed. For example, by the French during their mandate on Syria, physically with dynamite, they were destroying these beautiful ancient streets because they were dirty. They were too slum-like, you know? And so they want to see modern avenues for cars, etc., etc. And she explained very well, I never read something better than that, how this disconnected people and how this prepare conflict and incapability of people to talk to each other. That is what we see everywhere in Europe, everywhere in the West, in the United States too. Marwa traveled finally, left Syria only for traveling and giving speech and lectures. And she noticed also here in Italy that we are not so better than Syria, because the possibility of a war, of civil war, of total conflict between the people that were neighbor one day before, it's really high. Because we don't have any more a common landscape, we don't have any more a common architectural language, we don't talk to us anymore, we don't communicate, we just send impulses, despite we have all this technology for communicating, etc. And this is a matter of architecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefano. And I think it's important to emphasize what you were saying, that we need to find a different way. You know, this is not just the way the world is and there's nothing we can do about it and we're all angry and frustrated. No, these were choices that were made, and we have choices now to make, to change the direction that we're going in. And I think this is a very important point, one that Jane Jacobs and many others have emphasized, that we do have choices and we do have alternatives before us. And I think it's very important to be reminded of that. Thank you so much. Now, finally, and not least, our colleague Justin Shubow, who is with the National Civic Arts Society in the US and has been working to turn our attention to the public realm and its importance in our civic life. Justin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to take a somewhat different tack and talk specifically about the design of American federal government buildings, and with a view of looking at what do ordinary Americans prefer in architecture. Since this is a a classic question, well, we know what so many architects, especially elite architects, want to build, namely, sorts of modernism and postmodernism. But what do ordinary people think? People, who have not been educated, or you might say brainwashed, in architecture schools. And that is what we ultimately looked at. So let me share my screen here. So since the founding of the United States, there has been discussion regarding the architectural style or styles that are best for federal government buildings, including courthouses, department headquarters, and office buildings, both in the nation's capital and around the country. As desired by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the first government buildings, the White House and Capitol, were classical in design, as was the plan of Washington, D.C. Evolving over time, classicism, a tradition that includes neoclassicism, Greek revival, Beaux-Arts, and WPA style, set the precedent for federal government architecture for 150 years. During this, other forms of traditional architecture were on occasion used, including regional styles such as Pueblo revival and Spanish colonial. After World War II, however, the General Services Administration, which was established in 1949, that agency responsible for constructing federal buildings abandoned classical architecture in favor of modernism. And in 1962, GSA adopted the guiding principles for federal design, which formally rejected official classicism in favor of modernism. Government architecture came to be typified by the international style and brutalist style. And until the 1990s, there were few to no buildings constructed in a traditional architecture. In 1994, GSA instituted a design program still existing today that brought postmodern architecture to the fore. Under this program called Design Excellence, only 6 of the 78 federal buildings constructed have been classical or traditional. That is just 88%, with the remainder, or 92%, being modernist or postmodernist. In February 2020, there were press reports of a leaked draft White House executive order that would reorient federal architecture in a classical and traditional direction, including by requiring that new office buildings in Washington, D.C. be classical in design. These reports brought more public attention to the subject than has been seen in decades, indeed, if ever before. Our aim in undertaking this survey, which was conducted online by the Harris Poll on behalf of the National Civic Arts Society, and it was a poll of over 2,000 American adults. Our aim was to gain insights on Americans' architectural preferences. We wish to discover what matters most when it comes to US courthouses and federal office buildings. In other words, what do Americans really like? Well, the results show that Americans strongly prefer a more traditional look when it comes to the architecture of US courthouses and federal office buildings. Furthermore, the data suggests that the character and historical influence of the style may have an impact on preferences. So now if I can give a very quick run through of federal government architecture. This is going back to, the first really important public building in the United States, the Virginia Capitol, which was designed by Thomas Jefferson. This is what, really started classicism as a government style. Later, of course, we have the White House. This is an early design for the US Capitol. This was a competition that George Washington himself had a hand in. Later, there was the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, the Patent Office in Washington, D.C., the Pension Building also in D.C. This is from 1887. This is an example of an eclectic style that was built in the 19th century. This is a courthouse in Savannah, Georgia. You might say it's more, Italian Renaissance. Then in 1901, the Office of the Supervising Architect explicitly made classicism the official government style. I'm not going to read the statement, but all of it, but it says that the style is very pleasing to mankind. Subsequently, we got Beaux-Arts buildings like the Custom House in New York City by Cass Gilbert. This is a humble post office. There were many buildings like this built across the country, showing that even ordinary buildings could be built with dignity. A courthouse and a federal building in a smaller town. Then in Washington, D.C. in the 1930s, there was the large development of the Federal Triangle, which includes the FTC building. The Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, explicitly required that the design of the Federal Triangle be classical. Here's an example of a more stripped classical courthouse in Indiana. And here is an example of a regional style. This is more Spanish colonial, which you might say is appropriate for Texas, which is where this is located. Here's another regional style. This is a colonial revival courthouse in North Carolina. And an example of a Beaux-Arts skyscraper. So let me go faster to the 1962 guiding principles for federal architecture, which changed everything. It said that major emphasis should be placed on the choice of designs that embody the finest contemporary American architectural thought. Now, that was code for modernism. And the principles further stated that the development of an official style must be avoided. Design must flow from the architectural profession to the government and not vice versa. In other words, the architectural elites were to be dictating what the government should be building. And then we got the international style and other kinds of modernism, these boxy, unadorned buildings. In my view, very forgettable, no ornament, emotionally mute. Here is the Chicago Federal Center, designed by Mies van der Rohe, a building by Walter Gropius in Boston, the John F. Kennedy Federal Building. And here is the not too inviting entrance and plaza to that building. There is a notorious or famous building in Washington, D.C. by Marcel Breuer, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. 3 different secretaries of that department have called this building 7 floors of basement. And one of them said, a Democrat HUD secretary said that it looks like something from the Soviet Union. And then we have the FBI headquarters, which I like to call the Ministry of Fear, another brutalist design. Now we're getting into the Design Excellence Program, where postmodernism comes to the fore. At the same time, we still get some of those gun-slit windows that were typical of the mid-century modern buildings. Some glass boxes like this building by Richard Meyer in Phoenix, Arizona, talking about sustainability. As you might imagine, it was a very bad idea to build a glass atrium in Phoenix, one of the hottest places in America. The building gets so hot that security guards are allowed to wear shorts. And to my mind, the interior here is reminiscent of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon prison. Another courthouse by Richard Meyer. Here is a skyscraper in Cleveland, a skyscraper in St. Louis, one in Seattle. And, I would ask, do these even look like public buildings? A courthouse in Orlando that was very controversial. None of the judges wanted this, and they fought GSA. They wanted a traditional design, but they ended up losing. This is the ATF headquarters in Washington, D.C. by Moshe Safdie. A U.S. courthouse in Austin, Texas that has been compared to a Jenga cube. You might say deconstructivist courthouse in Las Vegas, assemblage of pieces that are stuck together. Courthouse in Miami that to me looks like a condo building. The U.S. mission to the United Nations, a building with very little design whatsoever. And then one of these more avant-garde designs in El Paso. Here, this courthouse that reminds me of a pharmaceutical headquarters as opposed to a public building. Let me go a little bit faster here. This is a new courthouse in Salt Lake City that is widely hated by the people there. And in fact, it was on the cover of the Salt Lake City Weekly, the headline being "Resistance is Futile, How Utah Ended Up with a Borg Cube for a Federal Courthouse." That's a reference to the bad guys in Star Trek. An avant-garde deconstructivist design in Oregon by Tom Main. Here's probably the most controversial federal building, also by Tom Main. This is in San Francisco. A close-up of that design. And the side of the building. And here's the interior, which arguably looks like it's already been hit by an earthquake in an earthquake-prone city. This also shows the urban context. To the left is that federal building. To the right is the older courthouse. As you can see, the newer building does not fit in at all. This is a rare example of a new classical building in America, Tuscaloosa Federal Building and Courthouse. The only reason this building got built is because one of the senators from Alabama fought for classical design in his state. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the survey that we did. Before I get to that, I do want to mention the prior studies that were done. In 2007, the American Institute of Architects undertook a survey of 2,200 random Americans, also conducted by the Harris Poll, of Americans' 150 favorite buildings. According to the survey, Americans strongly preferred buildings designed in a traditional style. Furthermore, in 2020, an academic study of courthouse architecture found that the study's participants preferred neoclassical designs for courthouses. As for our survey, what we did is provide 7 pairs of images of existing US courthouses and federal buildings. The buildings were not identified in any way. Each pair comprised 1 building in a traditional style and 1 building in a modernist style. The order in the pair was also randomized, as was the order of the questions. For each question, the survey question was, which of these 2 buildings would you prefer for a US courthouse or federal office building? From a long list of many dozens of photos, the 7 pairs of images were very carefully selected and edited to ensure fair comparisons. Factors such as sky color, angle of photo, light conditions, distance from the building, weather conditions, nature of foreground, nature and quality of street furniture, presence of street trees, parked cars, and passing people were all controlled for either perfectly or as far as possible via photo selection and editing. In all cases, the aim was to reduce to a minimum factor other than the building itself that might influence people's preferences. In addition, the use of a range of 7 pairs of photos rather than just one comparison permits confident conclusions to be drawn. So now to show the 7 pairs that we used, here is the first one. On the right, you can see that HUD building that I showed before, and on the left, the headquarters for the Environmental Protection Agency. As you can see, they're both large semicircular buildings. In this case, the classical building on the left was preferred by 81% of the study participants, not even close. Here's another example of brutalism on the left from Washington, DC, and on the right, the National Archives. Also in this case, it was the classical was widely preferred, 83% to 17%. Here are 2 other buildings. On the left, that glass courthouse in Phoenix, and on the right, a traditional building, which was preferred by 75% of the survey participants. In this case, the classical design on the right was preferred by 68% of the people. On the right here is one of those regional examples from Waco, Texas, which was preferred by 60% to 40%. On the left here is the colonial revival courthouse, and on the right is a modern courthouse. In this case, the buildings were closer in preference, with the traditional design being preferred by 58%. And finally, courthouse on the left by Pay Cobb Freed in Indiana, and on the right, a courthouse in Louisville, Kentucky. In this case, the classical design was preferred by 81% of the people. So overall, 72% of the 2000 American survey preferred the traditional option to the modern option. In other words, it was an overwhelming result. And what's very interesting that the political party of the participants was not a significant factor. So here we can see that Republicans, which is the right-wing party in America, 73% preferred traditional design, while Democrats, which are the left-wing party in America, preferred it at 70%. So there was no real significant difference. And this is important since some architectural elites will claim that these preferences in architecture are indicative of a political outlook. That modernism is progressive while traditional design is retrogressive or reactionary. But our survey proved, according to ordinary people, that that is not the case. Furthermore, income of the participants did not make any difference, showing that these preferences are not a matter of socioeconomic status. Likewise, there were similar preferences across all education levels, whether it's high school or less, college or college graduate. For age, there was a slight difference, with younger people preferring traditional a little bit less, but again, not much of a difference in this metric. And finally, as for gender, more women than men preferred the traditional option. So, we think it's highly significant that there was such an overwhelming preference for traditional over modernist architecture. And our study would suggest that this should not be a partisan issue whatsoever. And therefore that either party, a president who's a Republican or a president who's a Democrat, if they were to choose a selection process for buildings, one that favors classical and traditional designs would be more popular with the American people than the current system, which is largely modernist in orientation. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justin. I noticed on that slide that men prefer modern buildings more than women do, which suggests, I've heard this expressed by many of my colleagues, that it's a kind of a male thing in some ways. But also, I think we really need to think differently about these issues. Unfortunately, our thinking about these issues does get stereotyped into these ideological tracks that are often so wrong-headed, really, if we look at the research, thinking about old versus new, reactionary versus progressive, and so on. That's not really what the research is showing us. I'm just going to quickly show a couple of slides here that reinforce this point, that the research is showing that they're really, in the sense of beauty that people have, there are really two processes. One is based on the sort of biological roots, as we've all been talking about, and the other is more based on the subjective social constructions that maybe architects and planners and artists and others might bring to their understanding of the structure. But if you think about the way these things are grouped, most people tend to be, the research shows this too, most people tend to be grouped in a fairly large cluster. And then there are the outliers, of course, who are maybe more differentiated in their constructions and more extreme or more unique in thinking about what they like or what they consider beautiful. And this is a very important issue for those of us who are professionals or specialists. Are we designing for ourselves, for other colleagues like us who construct the world like we do or like our profession does? Or are we doing it for the users, for the real human beings who actually care about what it's like to live day in and day out around these buildings and around these places? And I think what you've seen, I hope it's come through in all of these presentations, that these issues are interconnected with one another. They're interconnected with how we can make a more beautiful world, a more durable world, a more ecological and healthier world, a more sustainable world that deals with all of these challenges that we have today. So I hope that has come through. And I think we will have an opportunity to discuss briefly these issues. I'm going to ask my colleague Nikos Salingaros now to serve as our discussant and give some reflections from his point of view on what we've been discussing today. Nikos.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for these wonderful presentations. The very difficult task now falls to me to try to connect all of these presentations. First, I want to express my extreme dismay at India and the Indian population for not tuning in. I expected to have 1 lakh of people following today's discussion. For non-Indians, that's 100,000 people, because today, if we synthesize the messages that were given, we have the solution to India's catastrophic urban and architectural problems presented today, or rather I should say in the series of 3 INHAF sessions that I helped to organize. I'm not trying to be arrogant here. but there is the content. So I would like to comment on every presenter's presentation in turn, and there's an enormous amount of materials. So let me start with Justin Shubo. So the message is to India. At this moment, the government of Delhi is redoing Lachin's Delhi, the New Delhi. The government buildings, exactly the problem that Justin addressed. And all over India, other cities are getting ready to tear down some of their old colonial buildings in order to build new buildings. What is the model for the new buildings? The model are the American and European buildings that Justin showed that are inhuman, that the Americans themselves don't like. So all over the world, the poll that Justin conducted is not widely known. It's widely known in the United States because it appeared and everybody jumped on Justin, severely criticized him, and they tried to take apart the poll, but they couldn't because statistically, it's beautifully done, as Justin showed. The statistics are there. People just hate these new buildings. So please, the population of India, don't copy the mistakes that we have made in the United States. That's why we invited Justin, to show you that. Now, from the actual facts on the ground, overwhelming statistics, why do Americans hate these new buildings? And then we go to Donald Ruggles, because the neurological responses to these buildings is negative. We feel frightened by these buildings. The experimental data is there. Those buildings make us feel uncomfortable. So what do people like? In the United States, Justin showed that people like the American traditional buildings, which is really European Greco-Roman traditional buildings. Okay, what in India, what is the tradition? India has a much wealthier tradition of architecture. Is that being used for major buildings today? Absolutely not. You have 3 millennia of Indian traditions, or rather parallel traditions, Hindu, Jain, early Delhi Sultanate, Mughal, and Lachins, even the colonials, which adapted some very nice architecture. Is that being used as the DNA of new Indian architecture? No. It's a shame. Shame on the people who commissioned these buildings, and shame on the government that actually copies the worst of European and American monstrosities in order to impose those on the population of India. And I'm talking about now government buildings. Now let's get to the real problem, which is the informal settlements. I have here Professor Sabikhi's wonderful book, A Sense of Space, which was, thank you, Geeta Auntie, for pointing out this book. It's a wonderful book. And Professor Sabikhi outlines decades of professional malpractice where the government just fails to understand that the informal urbanism is something that is organic to India and to Indian economy and to Indian culture, and just refuses to understand the forces that shape informal urbanism and that change the uses, and instead obstinately tries to put a mold, the most stupid, simplistic mold of regulations. Professor Sabikhi mentioned the 1962 Delhi urban plan. That was the most wrong-headed possible document by copying 1920s modernism from Germany and trying to impose it on Delhi. Of course it failed. It was totally crazy, and the planners did not learn. Still to this day, 50 years later, they have not learned. They still try to impose monofunctional zoning, which is totally against any human conception of the city. However, the 1962 plan had one good idea. That was an inviolate green zone around the city in order to guarantee health and greenery and oxygen. So what happened in India? the first people to violate the green zone were the government planners. They just sold the land and built everything. Total corruption. So the one good idea that the 1962 plan was wiped out, you know, in the blink of an eye in historical times. Okay, now Geeta showed us these inhuman environments that the government has built for the poor people to relocate them. Why do the people throw trash in the public space? Because the public space is ugly. It is inhuman. So we know that now from the neuroscience, as Donald Ruggles points out. You cannot build habitats for people that are ugly because they hate the habitats and they're going to destroy, they're going to fill them with rubbish. But then you have some government bureaucrats saying, well, why should we build beautiful buildings for the poor people? The poor people are expendable. We don't care about the poor people. And this is where, you know, I'm having goosebumps because we saw the government of India just totally ignore millions of people during the COVID crisis, as Professor Sabikhi pointed out. A national catastrophe. I am sad to say, you know, I'm not going to comment on the government of India. That's beyond my touch. But the planning authorities have treated the planning of the cities in the same cavalier fashion of just ignoring the poor people and try to impose their own stupid ideas that were discredited by all the research that has been mentioned today, and allowing free rein to extractive capitalism. You know, we don't have any communists on this panel. We have people who believe in free market capitalism, but the threat to the cities is this extractive huge power that goes in and just takes over well-functioning slums that need some help from the government. Instead, the people are thrown out and then driven to horrible, inhuman high-rises that dehumanize the people. And so finally now we have discredited the architectural typologies, and we can build the humane city, and the humane city looks very traditional. But we have the attacks from architectural academia that say, "Oh, you can't do that. That's old-fashioned." Well, listen, you know, the human body is old-fashioned, and now we have Stefano Serafini, who's promoting the biourbanism, who's promoting the urbanist city. So we have the solutions. We are offering them free. Please, people pay attention, and we will help anyone who's already thinking along those lines. Okay, I have talked too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. So I'll leave it to our host to moderate any questions coming in from the audience, or to decide to wrap it up as you choose.
Sir, there is one attendee who has raised his hand. So may I request him to talk?
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
Just I think he has. No, he is not there. You can continue, Kirti sir.
If you want, Michael, I have an observation.
Yes, Stefano, go ahead.
We talked a lot about public space and relevance of public space, etc. But we should look with a little bit of suspect also this term, because when we talk about public space, we mean serving private space. So in modern cities, especially in the West, public space has become just what is not private, and is meant to be there because private cannot exist without this connection. For example, public street to allow workers to go to work in a private company, for example. And that is becoming worse and worse and worse. I think we should stress more the concept of common space. Because, for example, the farmers who stop on the street and occupy land start making settlements and they get held by other people, that's not public. No government took care of them. The people was doing that. That's common. And that's key. I see that here in Artena. The interesting thing of Artena is that we have not much of a public space in the historical center where I live. It's a little town that they show in that picture where you cannot enter with cars. When you enter this space that's considered public, you feel that you are entering almost the house of everybody. So it's common. And this allows, for example, for interaction, social interaction. It's much more natural because there is a real interest of everybody into that space. Usually when we say public, we think, oh, it's of nobody's. It's nobody's space because it's public. Common space is everyone's space. And that's a very interesting, important concept to stress.
Right. You know, as you may know, I've done a lot of work on that. Nikos has on the idea that you don't just have public space as one thing and private space as another thing. You really have a tissue that interconnects them, and degrees of publicness and degrees of adjacency between these spaces, which is actually the way that people can connect by having a certain amount of control, because all cities have to protect us as well as connect us. You know, we have to be safe. We have to be private when we need to be private, and more public or less public in all the different kinds of urban spaces. That's a different way of thinking. And I think, again, there's one thread that runs through this discussion, and I think it's that we need to shift our ways of thinking to make this transition, and in some ways to recapitulate some of the evolved wisdom that is embodied in our cities and towns that people like Basim Hakim, his wonderful work, have uncovered, and the other people that we've all been describing here. This is not a secret. It's our own stubbornness and our own failure to learn from our mistakes that is perpetuating these problems, and we have no one but ourselves to blame, professionally speaking, and we need to recognize some of our professional weaknesses and turn to those. So does anyone else have any other quick final comments? I don't know if we have any other participants who are asking questions. Oh, there's a couple of questions that have come in, I guess.
I would like to say something, Michael, if I may.
Please, please.
Michael, I think, one of the most interesting things that I'd like to point out is that some of the things that Stefano referred to, and others also, is how, for instance, you have a series of things which are happening, like particularly the so-called informal sector of people just coming and occupying streets and setting up things. For example, I want to mention to you that in a city like Delhi, even though a large population, even 60% of the population are poor people, and for which there aren't the public facilities, like, for instance, even for shopping, for getting the things that they need. They can't afford to go to these fancy shopping centers, but we are building more and more shopping malls, big structures and things. But yet it's very interesting. For instance, in many parts of Delhi, they have what we call a weekly bazaars. And you know how it is? People just come, like, for instance, I've seen it happening. They come and occupy certain wide streets where there is enough space. The vendors come with boxes, which are just closed boxes. They set them up, and the boxes are opened up, and within a few minutes, you've got a splendid display of all kinds of products: clothes, jewelry, trinkets, food, whatnot, and it occupies the entire street. And all the people, the lower level people who can't afford to go to all the fancy bazaars, they go to these places to buy. And the so-called informal sector, they're now gradually infiltrating into major shopping centers. And the shopkeepers are objecting. They're saying, why are these people on the street being allowed to come here? But the fact remains that even the people who come to shop there, they buy the products from the vendors as well. And the vendors would not exist if there wasn't a need. And if they could not earn something, they would not be there. So it's a two-way process. They all need it, they're reacting. But what is more interesting is the manner in which they adapt. And for instance, they go in a place like, which is a, major sort of business center, Nehru Place, they have a series of open spaces, which during the day are just, by the side there are all office spaces, banks, shops. But in the evenings, when the offices close down, the vendors come and set up their stalls in the open spaces. And from all the surrounding neighboring areas, people come in there and the whole place comes to life. And they set up these stalls, they open up these boxes, and even though there's no proper lighting, no proper provision, and it's sad, but we really haven't reacted to sort of build the right kind of spaces for them. But the thing is that they even have battery-operated lights, and the whole place is a wonderful experience just to walk through, So what I think is that, there is a process of natural process of design which exists. This needs to be allowed to develop. We need to provide space for that. We need to plan for that. We don't. At the moment, we're just talking about, oh, we must get rid of that. Even the lawyers are saying this is amazing. They don't seem to understand that this is a need.
Yes,
Yeah.
the power of self-organization is something that we need to understand and recognize. The kind of problem a city is, it's not all top-down. You can't do everything top-down. You can only do a small part of it top-down, and you can certainly be taken in the wrong direction. We need to recognize these bottom-up processes, these self-organizing processes that are so important and have always been important in cities, especially in the greatest cities of the past. And in many ways where we've gone wrong is to fail to see that and to really destroy that, whether it's in natural systems, as Geeta was talking about with the rivers, or whether it's human systems. We must learn to support these living systems. Sorry, I have one question that has come in for Justin Shubow, asking whether the survey asked people why they preferred one style or another. Did they do so because it was, more comfortable or more livable or so on? I think I know the answer to that, but Justin, if you want to respond.
Sure. The survey simply asked preference between the two buildings. There was no further question about why people preferred one or the other. And one thing I failed to mention regarding the survey results is that there was also widespread support for traditional design among persons of all racial and ethnic groups as well. As for why this preference existed, one can speculate that they found the buildings more beautiful or more recognizable as public buildings, or particularly federal buildings. I think when most Americans think of a courthouse, they think of a classical building, with something like a pediment and columns, that there's particular building types in the United States that people think of when it comes to government buildings. There is, of course, empirical research that Nikos and others have highlighted about why people might prefer one kind of architecture over another. It is worth pointing out that there's been prior research that found that how architects evaluate buildings is very different from how ordinary people evaluate buildings. And not only is there such a large difference, but architects are not even able to predict how ordinary people will respond to a building. That's how far apart their brain is in a certain way from how ordinary people think. And, you know, needless to say, you know, architecture, by being public, you know, is small p political, and thus it really matters what ordinary people think. And it matters all the more so when it comes to government buildings, since of course these speak to, you know, who the people are, and it's their very tax dollars at work.
And what ordinary people feel in their day-to-day lives when they're around these buildings. You know, that's one of the things that I think we've highlighted, a number of speakers have highlighted, that there are biological roots to all of this. And yes, there are social constructions that are added to that and that differentiate people, especially professionals and architects, as you said, Justin. But we have to recognize, I think, that the primary root is in how people experience the world. They don't come to a building and start, you know, talking like an architect. Oh, well, it's having a witty dialogue with the street. I like that. No, they come in with their sort of prehension, not apprehension, but prehension of the building and how it makes them feel, and whether they feel well, whether they feel, you know, that they want to be there and live their lives there, not just regard it as a sculpture for, you know, 20 minutes. So this is a different cognitive frame for thinking about what kinds of buildings are important. Very different from all these sort of ideological constructions that tend to bog us down and distract us from serving human beings, which is what we should be doing, obviously.
Yeah, I
Any
just
other-
wanted to make a short comment, may I?
Yes, please, Geeta.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, and I think many of us are saying that agency to people, right? And traditional India was very much about that communities safeguarded their ponds and took care of them, and the forest with, you know, sacred groves and so on. So there's a huge tradition of people taking care of the cities. And the concept of Maidan, I helped run 7 studios with Columbia University in India, you know, dealing with water, with poverty, with informality. And every time it's about giving agency to people, so they are part of the solution. They know the solutions. The people who are closest to the problems are actually closest to solutions. So I think that we need to bring that back and enable people and empower people and give them agency to really, you know, do what's good for them, which is in fact good for the city.
Absolutely. Learning to distribute the agency rather than control the agency and concentrate it with capital or government or whatever these sort of centralized processes are. Not that there isn't a role for those things, but we're doing a very bad job of over concentrating, which is a theme that has run through, I think, our presentation today. Well, I think we are about 17 minutes.
No.
You want to keep talking?
Yeah. Donald wanted to say something.
Okay.
Donald, you had your hand up, please.
Well, I did. Michael actually summarized some of the comments I wanted to make, but Justin, the buildings that you were showing, I think neuroscience is starting to uncover why there is a preference for those buildings. And it has to do with efficient neurological processing. And humankind is looking for efficient ways to process what they see. And there's too much data coming into the brain second by second for the brain to focus on categorizing all that data. So it's looking for efficient ways to place it into patterns that it knows. And some of those patterns are part of our operating system that we're born with. It's part of our DNA. Other patterns are learned and acquired as you live your life. And that's known as bottom-up processing, which is emotional and inherited, versus top-down, which is rational and learned. And there's always a push-pull against those two spheres, bottom-up versus top-down. The buildings that you're highlighting are made up of patterns that, or particularly one pattern that is known to all humankind, which is the facial pattern. And it really roots back to the bonding that happens between caregiver and newly born child, and during the first minutes of life and the years thereafter. And the child learns to associate the facial pattern, which is a 3x3 pattern, with love and pleasure and empathy. And when we see that pattern later in life, and every single one of those preferred buildings that you showed were made up of a 3x3 pattern, then it triggers an empathetic pleasure response. And that happens subliminally. That happens without our control in our brain, and it activates the mesolimbic reward pathway and releases hormones into our system, which make us feel good. And that's why we like those buildings, because we feel good. And those hormones have significant health benefits to us. So there are health benefits to the buildings that you're featuring, Justin. And architects need to pay attention to this information. If we're building buildings that are stress-inducing, that actually diminish the health of society, there's liability issues here. And I think the profession is needs to come to terms with the fact that we're not paying attention to medical information that's available to the profession that affects our health and well-being. So that's my comment. And the survey you did is incredibly well done. Thank you so much for doing that.
So I want to also show another slide that relates to just what you were saying, Don. And this is relating to why we have this wiring. I mean, you've touched on that yourself, but I think if we think about why we find certain kinds of environments beautiful or ugly, there's some interesting research that suggests that this is because these are the environments that we have evolved to be well in. So we gravitate towards environments that are conducive to our health and well-being. And for example, this research suggests that the environments that potentially have pathogens are the ones that we find ugly, which really makes sense if you think about, you know, rotting food, or a place that's dangerous because there's a fire, or an environment that's unsanitary and so on. We find these places ugly. They actually trigger disgust in us. They trigger all these sort of negative stress hormones and so on. But ultimately, that's because our bodies have evolved to seek out places that are conducive to our well-being, and to avoid places that are not conducive to our well-being. So obviously, beautiful environments are likely to be more conducive to our well-being, whether it's a beautiful meadow or a natural environment, beautiful architecture, all of those things. So they're health-inducing in their own right, and they're also set up to allow us to seek health-inducing environments as well. I think that's very important for us to understand, that there are real biological roots to all of this that, as you say, Don, we have to pay more attention to, not only for our liability, but for our professional ethics. If we're serving humanity, if we're addressing the real challenges of our time, if we're relevant, because I think, frankly, if we're just putting costumes on these old industrial forms, as Stefano was describing, we are not relevant. We are making ourselves obsolete to the challenges that we face today.
Exactly.
Michael, I have a question that's been put to me by mistake, I guess. It was meant for Justin. It's from Geeta. And Geeta asks, I'm very curious if Justin's survey would produce similar results in India. My experience is that Indians are tired of the old rundown buildings and are looking forward to the modern buildings with clean lines. I see the old high court buildings, small court buildings in Mumbai, not being taken care of and are dilapidated.
Yes, Stefano, please, you answer that, and then I want to say something, and then we'll ask Justin to say something. This is a very important point. Do you have something?
To answer, I would rather connect to what has been said so far about the biological basis of neurological basis of beauty. That's of course that's in evidence. What Dr. Ruggles showed is very important. We speak about neuroergonomics even, no? When we do work like that, especially the military are using that. We try to put that also in design. But there is another side of that. That is the ethical beauty, moral beauty. In a way, to me, the lecture that I received from the work of Besimakim is that when we look at the beauty of these little ancient towns, we are not really looking at the beauty in the classical sense, like when you look at the Parthenon. You see another kind of beauty that is the reflection of a moral beauty. It's a social beauty. So that kind of order that you can find in nature and also in good architecture is reflected or is a reflection of an order that is inside our behavior and our behavior with the others and with ourselves. That I think it's a very important bridge to do. So we should have the ancient Greek concept kalokagatos. Kalokagatos means beautiful and good. The two things go together. Now, this question, of course, if I see something dilapidated, if I see something old, that speak an old language, that repeat it just mechanically because it was there and cannot be discussed, etc. This makes the thing less attractive. There is another aspect. If our civilization, like it happened in Italy, especially in Southern Italy is a culture that's been in a way won by the modern system of the northern country, industrialization, etc. And when your culture loses something, you start to look at that like an enemy. You feel not safe. So you want to imitate the winner. After the Second World War, after Italy has been defeated by America, most Italians were imitating the American model. So it's not just a matter of active propaganda by, movies, music, culture, etc., etc. That's a fact. But also the fact that psychologically, when you have been defeated, you don't want to be defeated. You want to identify yourself with the winner. And that's also another aspect that we should be aware of. We, the south of the world, in a way, I think of the Mediterranean culture, of the Middle East, of India, of this great culture, have a huge wisdom, tend to be prone to look at what comes from the so-called winners that are destroying the planet, by the way, because we want to identify and don't feel threatened. I think that's a psychological aspect that shouldn't be underestimated. So maybe that's an element that could play. That's my answer.
I would like to jump in and answer Sweta before we ask Justin. This is the old trick of how to destroy perfectly good buildings that needs a little bit of repair. Every living thing needs repair. Okay, the human body and the animal body repairs itself, otherwise we would die. So a historical building needs a little bit of repair, needs a little bit of cleaning. It is far more wasteful to tear it down and to build a modernist building in its place. But that's what the media want to brainwash you to believe. So be careful. This is what is broadcast by the media. These old dilapidated buildings, we just tear them down and we build a beautiful, sparkling modern building in its place. That's a lie. Only say 2 or 3% of dilapidated buildings really need to be torn down. But I think it is far more cost effective, and it will retain the beauty and the urban appropriateness if you repair the old building. So please be careful of that lie. Now the second question was to Justin. Why don't you do a survey in India? But be careful, because Justin did a wonderful survey with very carefully adjusted parameters so that the statistics are correct. So please go ahead and do a survey like that in India.
Well, Justin may or may not have the scope in his organization to do that work, but it seems like that would be very important. And again, more research is needed, more surveys, more understanding of these issues and complexities. I wanted to raise one point also in response to Stefano. I think it's absolutely true that there's a sort of identifying with the winner syndrome, but there's also the counter reaction, which is to become more hostile and to even become fanatical in one's hostility and one's anger and one's frustration. I think we're seeing a lot of that sort of backlash in many cultures today, which is very destructive, can be very destructive. You know, you would like to see more constructive energy around our problems that we have today, rather than, you know, societies tearing themselves apart. But speaking of Syria and the destruction of the traditional heritage there, many of you may know that Mohammed Atta, who led the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, was a planning student who was his master's thesis was on the destruction of Aleppo, Syria by modernist planning. And he was, you know, you can say he was a fanatic and he was a murderous person and he was very, very wrong in many ways. And yet you have to see these larger forces that he was responding to. He personally flew the plane that flew into the World Trade Center buildings, which to him were the symbol of, you know, modernization, modernity, modernism, globalism, etc. And so I think we have to recognize that there's a destructive rebound effect that's inevitable in these processes, and we need healing. We must not tear ourselves apart. We must learn from our mistakes and learn to unify ourselves around these issues. And we can't do that if we continue to double down on this sort of globalized, modernized view of the world, which is actually very obsolete at this point, ironically enough, as you see from the sciences that we're all talking about.
Michael, I don't know if you noticed, Dr. Nir Buras, who is joining us from the previous INHAF webinar, has his hand up. Can you enable him to speak?
Please,
and ask a
Nir,
question?
yes. Nir, I think you should be able to speak. We don't see your picture, but if you just hit your mute button, you should be able to speak.
I think you can hear me. I don't know. I don't know if I can be seen.
Well, go ahead and just we can hear you, so go ahead.
But I can talk a blue streak, as you all know. It's really interesting listening to you all together. And I still have a sense that we are all kind of blind men describing the elephant. It's a snake, it's 4 trees, it's a big rock, what have you. And I think that part of it, you know, George Bernard Shaw said that a man who calls a spade ought to be made to use one. But I'm going to step out on a limb here and call a spade a spade. The actual neuroaesthetic fits, and Nikos and I recently were part of writing an article about this with some neuroscientists. The actual neuroaesthetic fits of the traditional architectures of the entire world, as they stand, as they stood, and as they were generated, are de facto the finest tools we have from country to country for building the built environment in those places. And the idea that, and this is something that Justin hit on, which is, why do people love it? He's looking at it from the other angle. You're looking at it from the scientific, trying to understand what makes all that traditional stuff so attractive. But the bottom line, and this is something that I very humbly started discovering, was that it's a holistic system. And holistic means that if we're changing one part, we're changing the whole. If we're measuring one part, we're measuring the whole. And what underpins traditional architecture, and especially that of the West, is that it is based on a very simple notion that is put into the Vitruvian triad of firmness, commodity, delight. If they are really a holistic triad, then if you're changing one, you're changing the other. If you're measuring one, you're measuring the other. And all of a sudden, neuroaesthetic fit, the beauty scale of things, becomes primary, because that will give you the best well-being factors, the best social factors, the best durability factors. the best craft factors, all in one piece. And it is design dependent because we know that we need certain fractal patterns, symmetry being one of them, in order to create this kind of great visual experience. So I think connecting the dots, India is a great place to do that. India still has genuine building arts among its population. It has fantastic forms from many cultures. India has been a country, you can almost say that India and China are like cultural, very different types of beings. The one is very focused on itself and doing things from inside itself, China, and India has absorbed so many influences in its 5,000 years of building. And, you know, at the end of the day, Mohenjo-daro and Jaipur and New Delhi are really very, very, very close conceptually. So I would say, let's go for authenticity in India.
Thank you, Nir. I wanted to comment on one point. You know, you mentioned firmness, commodity, and delight. And as you may know, that was Sir Henry Wotton's translation of Vitruvius. And the word delight was actually the word venustus, which doesn't mean delight, it means beauty. So
yes, absolutely.
Why did he choose the word delight? Well, this was in 1624. This was the dawn of the Cartesian era. This was the time in human history when we began to back away from anything that was seen as subjective. And we wanted to try to be more objective and rational and so on. That was a very fateful moment in human history. And we've been dealing with the aftermath ever since, I think.
Thank you for making that comment. And I am so humbled to be in the company right now. I'm looking at all your faces, all these people, all you people who know everything. It's really amazing. So I love India. I've been to India. I'm an architect because of the Taj Mahal. The first time I saw it, I was 10 years old, and it made me think, what is in all this? You know, I mean, this was like unraveling a puzzle, and it took me 65 years to unravel it to my satisfaction. Thank you for having me on. Thank you. Best.
Thank you, Nir. Any other final comments?
I want to hear from Professor Kirtisha.
Well, I'm going to come in and not only summarize, but I think let me kind of come back and say a few things. First of all, listening for last 2 hours, I was thinking, how much could one stack in a one session of 2 hours? And this has been simply remarkable for its richness. And just imagine the kind of areas, you know, and universities we have traversed. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll come back for the formal sort of thank you. But let me kind of make few observations, you know. And I think, you know, if you're really looking at architect as a contributor to the making of human settlements, the Indian reality is dramatically different, which must be understood. Not only Indian reality, South Asian reality. Look, India has about 1,400 million people, and we have 638,000 villages, in which about 1,000 million people live. No formal architect has ever practiced in villages. There have been traditional, conventional, I think, you know, people who have been involved in the process of creating settlements, building buildings. But if you really see, and I go on saying this all the time, that out of a total housing stock of about 170 million units in the villages, except for 30 million which have been created through governmental programs. 70% of the housing stock has been created by people themselves. No architects, no engineers, no housing finance agencies, no building bylaws. People have created it, and people had created very, very beautifully. You got to go to Kutch and see the kind of settlements people are there. Their understanding of climate, their understanding of material, their understanding of sociology, their understanding of people behavior. And therefore, this is one dimension that you got to look at. Second dimension that you could look at in the context of urbanization, the cities. Not many people know that even our cities, not more than 6 to 7% of the buildings are designed by architects. 94%, 90% of the buildings are done either by people or people who are not necessarily trained architect in that sense. And if you just look at one dimension, the housing, there's a very interesting statistics, which I tend to quote most of the time, that out of 10 buildings or houses that get built in our cities, if one is done by public sector, 2 are done by private sector, 7 are done by people sector. People do it themselves. In a context like this, where do we really think about form, and where do we think about, beauty and aesthetics? And what I'm trying to kind of say is this, that we've got to see it from people's perspective. You've got to see it, from the whole angle of how do you look at human settlements, how do you look at the whole process of creating those settlements, and how do you look at the role that people play. In the context of sustainability, and Geeta ji, I don't know where you've been, I think for a long time. Why have I not met you before? Because we have been talking about slums not only as problem, but slum as solutions. People's solutions. There's a way of looking at things. You just look at more than half of Bombay's population living in slums. And one way of asking this question is this, that these people are encroachers, these people are creating ugly settlements, these people are really living in this particular fashion. If you also look at differently, that these people came to city not to live in housing. They came for employment, they came for services, they came for jobs, they came for progress. And system was not able to provide housing. And therefore, if they had not taken initiative, if they had not solved this problem, they essentially would be living under the sky, not in poor housing that they're living in. And therefore, these are people's solutions based on their resources, based on their compulsions, based on the conditions in which they have really found themselves. And therefore, you just can't blame people for what they've done. You've got to kind of look upon what they've done as a starting point of creating housing, improving it, and therefore, we know and go on saying all the time, the solutions to the slum problem in our cities is not only in the context of giving them formal housing, the solution lies in improving settlements that people have created themselves over a period of time, providing them services, giving them secure land tenure, and assisting them so that they could improve shelter that they've done. And if this is done, they would go very far in terms of improving their housing. So this is looking at the housing in the context of what people do and people's solutions. I also wanted to kind of use this opportunity and tell you this wonderful group of people. And even though Kia talked about it in the beginning, I want to repeat this slide of some dimension of it. We are running this particular webinar series for last 15 months. And this is the 65th webinar. And this is on one theme, and that is called Rethinking City. What reason we are talking about is this, that where Indian cities are, where they grow, the way they develop, something is terribly wrong with it. In terms of, and just like anything, take governance, take water, take environment, take pollution, take anything, something is wrong. And I think, we just cannot afford not to deal with these issues as fast as possible, because we're growing very fast. We had something like 370 million people in our cities 2011. And we are talking about somewhere around 870 million people in 2050 in our cities. We're talking about 30 years time, India to have as many as 870 million people. And if you really have so many people, and if you're not really kind of able to kind of deal with these problems fast enough, you're really, I think, looking into a major crisis. And therefore, while as people are talking about, I think climate change is a crisis, time and again we feel that urbanization, the whole urban thing, is getting into crisis if we don't really handle well. And what is very important is this, that not only we have this, and I think in the urban context is very important, not only in the context of number of people. Other thing which is very important is the role cities are playing in terms of economic. If you are producing, I think, 65 to 75% of growth through cities, if you really have ambition to kind of remove poverty, if you really want to grow at the rate of 7-8%, you've got to put your cities in place. You've got to manage them well. And therefore, if you don't do that management, if you don't do that planning, if you don't do that development properly, you essentially are compromising on your future. And that future is unfolding, is happening tomorrow. And therefore, there's a great emergency in terms of how do you look at the problems and how do you solve them. There is another thing that I go on saying, that we cannot leave dealing with the larger complex urban issues only in the hand of the government. Government is doing whatever it can. What I also personally feel, the way things are happening, these issues are not going to be handled by academic community, by business. You've got to kind of find a way to deal with these issues. And I first time and again say that there's a possibility that a larger, wider coalition of people can emerge through a civil society initiative, where business, industry, professional, academic get together and think of alternatives that we need in order to kind of find our better cities. And you've got to look at the role of architects in that context. Also in the context of large number of crises, we have a water crisis, we have a resource crisis, we have environmental crisis, we have climate change coming in. And how responsive we are in the context of dealing with those crises, and how are we managing it. You also have the whole issue of a very long and very powerful traditions in which cities, housing, people, and structures have been built. And what is happening is this, that while you've got to put them in the center of the process of creating a new habitat, you essentially are keeping them out. And therefore, how do you deal with the whole issue of creating settlements? How do you really kind of involve people in the whole process is something that is very important. And you've got to look at in your institutional mechanism, you've got to look at in your delivery system, you've got to look at, I think, in your education. One of the reasons one is talking about, that we have not been able to kind of deal with our urban issues properly. And one tends to, I tend to kind of put this, I think, symbolically. And I think, and I'm talking about this because I think Geeta, he talked about, national capital. We have 3 capital cities. We have Mumbai as a capital city, is the wealth capital. An interesting part of Mumbai is this, that it's probably the only city anywhere in the world where number of people living in slums and higher than the people who live in ordinary housing. It's a great example of a failure of a city which is with its wealth capital. We have Delhi as a political capital, and the High Court of the city some time ago said that the air is so highly polluted that it looks like, I think, you know, what was this word was what was used for Auschwitz and other places, you know, I think in Germany, that it was killing people. We have our religious capital, Varanasi, and we have our very holy river Ganges. We have polluted it so much that we require a special ministry to clean it up. Now, if you are not really manage your political capital, if you are not really kind of manage, you know, I think, you know, your wealth capital, and if you are not really manage your spiritual religious capital, how would you have managed your smaller cities, other cities well? And I think, you know, that essentially goes on to say that we have got to kind of, you know, look inwards and see how do we find ways to deal with our cities, and how early and what form we do it. I just wanted to kind of, you know, ask very quickly a question to Justine, whether this analysis is done in terms of what do people like, whether it was ever put to the community of architects, and how do they respond to this particular assessment. And I'm not looking for an answer. I'm just trying to kind of, you know, making an observation that architects will not really kind of be very concerned about them, because they don't necessarily design for people; they design for themselves. And it's very important how this is seen in the context of new structures being created, new cities being formed, and new ways in solving human settlements problems. So I think these are some very, very quick random responses before I come to just two small little kind of things that I wanted to mention. One was this, that just about 15 years ago, a very interesting process where civil society actors got together at a town called Konton in Malaysia, and they were trying to kind of, you know, project a image or dream of a city in Asia. And I think they put together this very interesting 7-point, you know, I think, imagery. They said we got talking about politically participatory city, we are economically productive city, we are socially just city, we are environmentally sustainable city, and we are culturally vibrant city, we are technologically adaptive city, and we are talking about people-centric and therefore poor sensitive cities as well. And I think this imagery that emerged from a civil society process, I personally feel something very hopeful and positive about. Having said this, I think let me kind of go back and to wind this up, let me thank Michael Mehaffy for anchoring this highly informative and thought-provoking conversation. It was remarkably rich, you know, in its content, and very, very informative. I also must thank for all help in planning and the skillful handling of the event that he did. Thanks also are due to the panelists for their time, for their energy, and for their remarkably rich sharing. And therefore, thank you very much, Stefano. There is so much to kind of understand from you in terms of what you're doing. Ranjit, Civic, very passionate, and I'm very glad you came again and spoke with such length and feeling. Geeta ji, once again, there is such a wonderful resonance from on what you're saying, and I would want to kind of relate with you at some other point in time and share what I've written about the Sabarmati riverfront, what I've been doing this on slums, what I've been doing this on cities. So absolutely wonderful to hear you. Justin Saab, very good your analysis and telling us in terms of what people like. And Donald, it's remarkable, and I think you have essentially open our appetites in terms of what you see when your session comes up on the 7th of December. Let me inform everyone that we are showing this movie on Built Beautiful, an architecture and neuroscience love story. It's a documentary of about healing powers of architecture. And we would have Donald and many others participating. Donald will be presenting this movie, and we would have 4 others commenting on the presentation. I also must, before ending, I must thank once again Nikos Salingaros, without whose help this event would not have been possible at all. He's been very kind, very energetic. I know, I don't know how many letters we have exchanged in the last few months, few weeks. I know very well that if I send the email, I will have a response in 10 minutes or half an hour, 1 hour. I think it's incredible energy and enthusiasm for this. So thank you very much. Without you, this would have been absolutely impossible. This very distinguished group of people we would have never put together on one single platform, and it's because of you. So thank you very much. And at last, I must thank my colleague Ankisha for all the work she has done backstage, without which this would not have been possible. Let me also apologize because Nikos brought in this point. Yes, I do think 100,000 people should have been listening to this debate and this discussion. It's so vital, so important, so rich, and so meaningful. We have not been able to kind of get them, but I'm sure this is being recorded, and we would find ways to reach out to younger professionals, to students, and to many others who are interested. This is one of the richest sessions we have had, and thank you very much for your contribution. So thank you very much.